My name is Julia Fox, 29 years old, a captain in the United States Army. I learned that in the military, your rank is your identity. But I never expected that in my own family, my rank would be an insult. At the VFW Post gathering in Savannah, amidst the air thick with the smell of beer and old war stories, my father, General George Fox, raised his glass. His eyes swept past me, cold and vacant. "Legacy," he said, his voice echoing through the quiet room. "I have no son to carry it on." He paused, a cruel smirk touching his lips. "I only have Captain Fox." The entire room held its breath. She wears the rank, but she'll never understand the weight of this legacy. She was born to follow orders, not to lead. I felt dozens of pairs of eyes on me, not with sympathy, but with a morbid curiosity. I stood there, motionless, publicly executed by my own father. He was wrong. He knew nothing about the key my grandfather left behind, and he certainly didn't know that it would unlock a truth that could level his entire counterfeit world. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and hit that subscribe button if you've ever had your very existence denied by the people who were supposed to love you most. This fight is for all of us. Just minutes before that fatal speech, I'd been feeling a rare, unfamiliar warmth spread through my chest. It was a flicker of pride. General Miller, an old friend of my father's from his days at the Citadel, had clapped me on the shoulder, his grip firm and respectful. His breath smelled faintly of good bourbon. "Your report on Sahel tactics was brilliant, Captain," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. "Your father must be damn proud." I just smiled, the professional, tight-lipped smile I'd perfected at West Point. But inside, his words felt like a sliver of sunlight breaking through a perpetual storm cloud. I had spent my entire life trying to earn a fraction of that sentiment from my own father, and hearing it from a man he respected felt real. It was a validation I was starved for. Then my father stepped up to the podium, and that single ray of sunlight was extinguished by a blizzard. He stood there, ramrod straight, a living monument to the Southern military tradition. The room, filled with men who saw him as a legend, fell silent. I watched him, my training kicking in, analyzing his posture, the subtle tension in his jaw. When he said, "I only have Captain Fox," the way he emphasized my rank wasn't respect. It was a weapon. He spat the title out, turning my greatest achievement into a mark of otherness, a formal designation he used for a subordinate, not the name of his own child. He had stripped me of my name, of my place in the family line, right there in front of everyone. After his speech, the air around me seemed to become a vacuum. The convivial buzz of the room returned, but it skirted around the small, empty space I occupied. General Miller, who moments before had been my champion, suddenly found the amber liquid in his bourbon glass intensely fascinating, refusing to meet my eyes. Other soldiers, men I'd been taught to revere as titans, now looked straight through me as if I were a ghost haunting the corner of the room. Their silence was a collective command, a unified front. "We stand with the general." I kept my back straight, my chin up, my posture a testament to 4 years of relentless discipline at West Point. It was a physical mask I wore to keep from shattering. But beneath the crisp fabric of my dress uniform, I could feel their eyes peeling away the rank, the honors, the uniform itself, leaving behind nothing but a lonely, rejected child. Their silence was not neutral. It was an endorsement. It confirmed that in my father's world, a world I had fought so hard to enter, I simply didn't exist. The final nail was hammered into the coffin a few weeks later. The reading of my grandfather's will took place in the old family home in Savannah's historic district. It was July, and the air was more suffocating than the Georgia heat, thick with unspoken resentments and the heavy scent of magnolia. Spanish moss hung from the ancient live oaks outside like gray skeletal fingers, casting long shadows across the porch. My father sat in my grandfather's worn leather armchair as if it were a throne, the undisputed king of a kingdom I was never a part of. The family lawyer, Mr. Caldwell, droned on in a monotone voice. My name was mentioned only once, like a footnote in the grand history of the Fox family. "And to my granddaughter, Julia Fox," the lawyer read, peering over his spectacles. I leave the key to storage unit number 11. A sound cut through the oppressive quiet. It was a scoff from my father, short, sharp, and precise as a scalpel. An old storage unit, he said to no one in particular, but for everyone to hear. How fitting. The words were more than just contempt. They were a sentence of exile. He wasn't just dismissing the inheritance. He was defining my worth. I was the leftover junk, the forgotten memories, fit only to be locked away in a dusty, forgotten room. I felt the familiar sting behind my eyes, but I refused to let a single tear fall. A soldier does not cry. A soldier endures. When the others had filed out, leaving me alone with the fresh layer of humiliation, the old lawyer, Mr. Caldwell, motioned for me to stay. He waited until my father's heavy footsteps had faded down the hall. "Captain," he said softly, his voice a stark contrast to the harshness I was used to. His eyes, clouded with age, held a flicker of genuine sympathy. "Your father doesn't know about this." He slid a yellowed, brittle envelope across the polished mahogany table. It felt ancient, sacred. "Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore gave this to me years ago," he explained, referring to my grandfather. "He instructed me to give it to you, and only you, on the day you felt you no longer belonged here." My fingers trembled slightly as I took it. Inside was a small folded piece of paper. The handwriting was my grandfather's, strong, disciplined, the script of a career soldier, even when weakened by age. It read, "They do not define who you are. Storage Unit 11. Approach when ready." I stared at the words, reading them over and over. A cold clarity washed over me, pushing back the tide of pain. This wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a comforting note. This was an order. And it was the first order I'd ever received that didn't come with the silent, crushing weight of judgment. It was a directive from the past, a mission. And in that moment, standing in the ruins of my family, it was the only thing I had left to hold onto. The next morning, I was in my Jeep before the sun had a chance to burn the mist off the Savannah River. My grandfather's order, "Approach when ready," echoed in my mind. Ready? I wasn't ready. I was hollowed out, running on the fumes of yesterday's humiliation. But in the Army, you learn that readiness isn't a feeling, it's an action. You move. So I drove. The route took me away from the manicured squares and historic charm of downtown, out past the city limits where the Spanish moss gave way to chain-link fences and rusted corrugated steel. This was the forgotten edge of Savannah, an industrial park left behind by progress, a graveyard of forgotten businesses. It was the perfect place to hide a secret. Storage Unit number 11 looked like all the others. A roll-up metal door painted a faded, anonymous blue. The key, heavy and old-fashioned brass, felt cold in my hand. It slid into the lock with a grating sound. I put my shoulder into it, and the door shrieked in protest as I heaved it open, letting in a shaft of hazy morning light. The air that rushed out was thick with the smell of time itself. Dust, dry wood, and something else. Something familiar. It smelled like my grandfather. Inside, amidst a few stacks of old books and tarp-covered furniture, was a standard-issue military footlocker. It was olive drab with Whitmore, E., stenciled in faded white paint on the side. Unlike everything else in the unit, it was immaculate, free of dust, as if it had been waiting in a state of suspended attention. It wasn't just stored, it was staged. I ran my fingers over the two words carved neatly into the wooden lid, Cascade Echo. It wasn't my grandfather's handwriting. It was precise, deliberate. It sounded like a code name, a mission. My heart hammered against my ribs. I felt like I was crossing a line of departure, entering uncontrolled territory. I lifted the heavy lid. The scent that hit me was one of discipline and the past, a potent mix of cedar, old canvas, and gun oil. Inside, everything was orderly. Folded uniforms, a compass, a few medals in a velvet box. My hand brushed against a standard-issue field watch, its face cracked clean across the middle. Touching the cold, broken glass was like touching a live wire. A memory I had buried deep within the strategic folds of my mind erupted with the force of an ambush. I was 18 years old. It was Christmas Eve. The house was filled with the warm, festive scents of pine needles from the towering tree and my mother's honey-glazed ham roasting in the oven. Twinkling lights reflected in the polished silverware. It was a perfect picture of an American Christmas, a carefully constructed illusion of family harmony. I had just received my early acceptance letter to West Point. My dream. The one thing I had worked for, bled for, through 4 years of high school. I made my announcement at the dinner table, my voice trembling with a joy I couldn't contain. For a moment, there was silence. My father, sitting at the head of the table, didn't even look at me. He just gave a curt nod, a dismissal, before turning to my cousin, Mark, who had recently dropped out of community college. "Well," my father said, raising his glass of whiskey, "at least Mark here knows how to enjoy his life." The comparison was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. Then, my mother placed her hand over mine. Her touch was soft, her smile sweet, but her words were pure acid. "Oh, honey, I'm so proud of you. I really am," she cooed, her voice dripping with southern charm. "But West Point, it's all men, darling. You'll never find a good husband there." Just like that, my life's greatest achievement was reduced to a marital liability. It wasn't just that they didn't see my victory. They saw it as a flaw, a perversion of what I was supposed to be. I remember looking down at my plate, at the festive swirl of cranberry sauce, and feeling utterly, completely alone. If you've ever had a victory of yours turned into a lecture or a piece of unwanted advice, hit that like button to show some support. And tell me in the comments, what's the one thing someone said that was supposed to be helpful, but just wasn't? I shook my head, the motion sharp and deliberate, pulling myself out of the memory's grip. I am an intelligence officer, I thought, my internal voice cold and clear, not a victim. Analyze the data. And the data was right in front of me. This footlocker wasn't a time capsule, it was an evidence locker. Beneath a faded tactical map of Grenada, my fingers found it, a single, metal dog tag. My breath caught in my throat as I read the stamped letters. Fallow Marcus W. U.S. Navy. Navy. My mind raced. Why was a Navy dog tag in the footlocker of a career Army officer? In the fiercely tribal world of the U.S. military, it was more than just unusual. It was a glaring contradiction. I flipped the tag over. On the back, a single, rough X was scratched into the metal by hand. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a souvenir. It was a message, deliberately left for me to find. My eyes scanned the rest of the chest, landing on the yellowed envelope Mr. Caldwell had given me. I had put it in here last night, feeling it belonged with the rest of these ghosts. Now I opened it again. My grandfather's handwriting, though shaky with age, was still infused with the discipline of a man who had lived his life by regulations. Julia, the letter began. They will never acknowledge you, because your existence is a reminder of what they are not. Do not seek their validation. Seek the truth. I read the next line, and a cold dread washed over me. The truth will give you peace, but only when you know what to do with it. This wasn't just a comfort, it was a warning. He wasn't just handing me a key to the past. He was handing me a burden, a responsibility that went far beyond a family feud. He was giving me a new mission. And for the first time in my entire life, I felt the terrifying, liberating weight of being truly trusted. I didn't go home that night. The truth, or at least the beginning of it, was a cold, hard lump of metal in the pocket of my jeans. It felt heavier than it should, a gravitational pull dragging me away from my personal grief and back toward my professional purpose. Pain could wait. The mission had begun. I drove back to Fort Stewart, the familiar gates a welcome sight in the encroaching darkness. My apartment, with its quiet emptiness, felt like a liability. What I needed was control. What I needed was data. My office was in the SIF, the Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. To civilians, it's just a bland acronym. To me, it was a sanctuary of logic, a concrete bunker where emotion couldn't penetrate. There are no windows in a SCIF. The air is perpetually chilled and tastes recycled. The only sound the constant low hum of servers processing the nation's secrets. It's a place designed for isolation, for focus. Tonight, that isolation felt less like a prison and more like armor. I badged my way through 3 layers of security, the heavy vault door hissing shut behind me, sealing me off from the outside world. Inside, under the unforgiving fluorescent lights, I wasn't Julia Fox, the rejected daughter. I was Captain Fox, G2 Intelligence. I sat down at my terminal, the ergonomic chair of familiar comfort, and logged in. This wasn't Google, this was JEWIX, the Joint Worldwide Intelligence Communications System, the military's private, classified internet, a place where truths are stored and lies are buried. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the muscle memory of my job taking over. I typed the name from the dog tag into the global search query. Fallow Marcus W. I hit enter. The system, with its near-infinite memory, took a few moments to comb through decades of digitized archives, from after-action reports to declassified communiques. For 30 agonizing seconds, the cursor blinked on the screen, each flash a beat of my own heart. Then a single, thin file appeared. I clicked it open. The information was sparse, the digital equivalent of a ghost. Staff Sergeant Marcus Fallow, United States Marine Corps Force Reconnaissance. A hard hitter. Status: missing in action. My eyes scanned down, my training forcing me to absorb every detail until they landed on a line that made the cold air of the SCIF feel like ice in my veins. Theater of Operation. Operation Urgent Fury, Grenada. Date of incident, 25 October 1984. Grenada, 1984. The date burned itself into my brain. Immediately, I opened a separate, secure window. My fingers were steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. I pulled the service record of Lieutenant Colonel Everett Whitmore, my grandfather. I knew this file by heart. As a child, I'd read it like other kids read fairy tales. It was the story of my hero, a roadmap of honor and duty that I had tried to follow my entire life. I knew every commendation, every duty station, every promotion. And I knew, with absolute certainty, the final entry. It was still there, unchanged, a fixed point in the universe of my life. Honorable Discharge and Retirement. 0 Worst, June 1982. I stared at the 2 dates on my screen, side by side. 1982, 1984, a 2-year gap, 2 full years. My grandfather had been a civilian for 29 months when Staff Sergeant Marcus Fallow went missing in action. In my world, the world of intelligence, there are no coincidences, only unrecognized patterns. In the world of military records, there are no mistakes, only lies. This wasn't just an anomaly. This was an impossibility. It was a flagrant, unforgivable discrepancy in the sacred texts of the armed forces. It was a cardinal sin, a deliberate corruption of the one system I had built my entire life upon. The foundation of my world didn't just crack, it disintegrated, leaving me in freefall. The sun was a pale suggestion in the eastern sky when I finally drove back to the storage unit. It was no longer a place of memory. It was now a crime scene. I saw everything through a new lens, the cold, analytical filter of my profession. Every object was evidence. Every piece of dust was a potential clue. I worked methodically, sectioning the footlocker into a grid in my mind. I examined every crease in the folded uniforms, checked the pockets, ran my fingers along the seams. And there, tucked beneath the worn canvas liner at the very bottom of the chest, I found it. A single, black and white photograph. It was old, the edges curled with time. In it, a younger version of my grandfather, lean and hard in his field fatigues, stood with his arm around another Marine. The man was laughing, a wide, unguarded grin that lit up his face. Based on the age, I knew it had to be Marcus Fallow. But that wasn't what made me stop breathing. It was the space between them, a strange, empty void. Someone had taken a blade, a sharp one, maybe a standard-issue K-bar knife, and had surgically excised a third person from the photograph. The cut was perfect. It was clean, cold, and deliberate. This wasn't the clumsy act of a jilted lover tearing up a painful memory. This was the precise work of a soldier redacting a document. It was the calculated removal of a threat, the sanitization of a record. Someone was editing history. And the chilling thought that slammed into me was that the editor might have been the very man I called my hero. I knew then that digital archives and dusty photographs could only take me so far. I had reached a dead end. Data could tell me what happened, but it couldn't tell me why. For that, I needed a human source. Back at my apartment, I pulled out my grandfather's old address book. It was a small leather-bound volume, the pages filled with his disciplined script. I flipped through the names, most of them crossed out over the years. Then I found him. A name listed under V. Vets. Amos Hargrove, former U.S. Navy SEAL, served with my grandfather. Finding a retired SEAL who doesn't want to be found is next to impossible, but I wasn't a civilian. A call from an active-duty Army captain carries weight. It opens doors. It took me 2 hours of navigating veterans' networks and making carefully worded inquiries, but I finally got a number for him in a sleepy little fishing town on the Florida coast. I rehearsed my lines, then dialed, my heart pounding a steady, tactical rhythm. An old, gravelly voice answered on the third ring. Hargrove. Mr. Hargrove, I said, my voice all business. This is Captain Julia Fox. I'm Everett Whitmore's granddaughter. I need to talk to you about an old operation. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, thick with caution and years of unspoken history. I could practically hear him sizing me up, deciding if I was a threat. Finally, the tired, raspy voice came back, resigned. Tomorrow, Salty Dog Cafe, 0600. The line went dead. I had my meeting, and my first real lead. The 4-hour drive south on I-95 before dawn should have been a grueling test of endurance. But for the first time in weeks, I wasn't just running on caffeine and anger. I was fueled by a flicker of hope. The black ribbon of highway unwound before my Jeep's headlights, the world still asleep. In the solitude of the driver's seat, I allowed myself a luxury I hadn't felt since before the VFW meeting. Optimism. Amos Hargrove was my only lead, a ghost from my grandfather's past. But his voice on the phone, it held something I hadn't heard in years. Respect. He hadn't asked questions. He didn't demand explanations. He heard the name Everett Whitmore, and that was enough. In that brief professional exchange, I wasn't the disgraced Captain Fox. I wasn't my father's failed legacy. I was Everett Whitmore's granddaughter. The title connected me to a heritage of honor, not one of shame. That feeling, that sense of belonging, however tenuous, was a powerful propellant. It was a taste of the validation my father had so cruelly withheld. For a few precious hours, I let myself imagine finding more than just answers in that little Florida cafe. I let myself imagine finding an ally, maybe even a friend, someone who knew the man my grandfather truly was, not the silent, distant figure I remembered. The thought was a small, warm glow in the cold emptiness of my investigation. It was 0500 hours, 5 o'clock in the morning. The sky was beginning to bruise with the first hints of purple and orange to the east. The GPS showed I was 30 minutes from my destination, a sleepy coastal town just over the state line. The hope in my chest felt solid, real. And then my phone rang. The sound was a violent intrusion in the quiet cab of the Jeep. I glanced at the screen. Blocked number. My training took over instantly. My posture straightened. My senses went on high alert. This wasn't a social call. I thumbed the answer button. Fox? Captain Fox? The voice was male, deep, and utterly flat. It was a voice that had been scrubbed clean of all emotion. A voice that registered no surprise, no anger, no curiosity. It was the voice of a man who was merely a function, an instrument. This is she, I said, my own voice betraying none of the sudden tension coiling in my stomach. Your meeting with Hargrove is cancelled. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a request. It was an order, delivered with the casual authority of a man who had never been disobeyed in his life. My hand tightened on the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. Who is this? I demanded, keeping my tone even, professional. Someone advising you to turn your car around and drive back to Fort Stewart, the voice replied, the pace of his words unhurried. Forget the name Marcus Fallow. There are campaigns that aren't in the service records, Captain. Don't make yourself collateral damage. A chill, entirely separate from the morning air, snaked its way up my spine. Collateral damage. The term was clinical, impersonal. It was how you described an unavoidable tragedy, an acceptable loss. He was telling me that my life was expendable. I forced myself to breathe. In, out. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, the lie smooth and practiced. Deny everything. It's the first rule of engagement. There was a pause on the other end, but it wasn't one of hesitation. It was the pause of a teacher giving a slow student a moment to catch up. Then let me be clearer, the voice continued, its dispassionate tone somehow more menacing than any threat. Cascade Echo is a Regulation 302 Alpha operation. It doesn't exist. If you keep digging, Captain, no one is coming to save you. Because officially, you're not in any danger. The line clicked. He was gone. The silence he left behind was deafening. It was heavier, more profound than the quiet that had come before. I was alone in my car, doing 70 miles an hour down a dark highway, but I felt exposed, as if I were standing naked in a spotlight. Regulation 302 Alpha. The designation wasn't in any field manual I'd ever studied. It wasn't in any official list of protocols. It was slang. It was the kind of term you hear whispered in SIFs late at night, a ghost story operators tell each other. It was the unofficial classification for the darkest of black operations, the missions that were so deep, so dirty, that the government would deny their existence to its dying day. Deniable ops, off the books, untraceable. My training screamed at me to turn the car around. This was an unwinnable fight. I was a captain with a top-secret clearance, but I was a part of the system. This was something outside the system. This was a force that could cancel a meeting with a retired Navy SEAL with a single phone call. A force that knew my name, my rank, and my exact location. They could erase me, and as the voice had so chillingly promised, no one would even know to look for my body. The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot of dread in my gut. But something else was rising to meet it, a hot, furious wave of defiance. My father had tried to erase me with words. Now, these shadows were trying to erase me with threats. A quote from General Patton, one my grandfather used to recite, flashed in my mind. If everyone is thinking alike, then somebody isn't thinking. The voice on the phone, my father, the silent soldiers at the VFW, they were all thinking alike. They were all telling me, in their own way, to stand down, to know my place, to be quiet. They thought a single, anonymous threat could make me abandon my mission. They thought I would just meekly turn my Jeep around and forget everything I'd found. They didn't know who I was. I am the granddaughter of Everett Whitmore. I am an officer of the United States Army. I do not retreat when threatened. I do not abandon the search for a soldier listed as missing in action. My foot, which had eased off the gas pedal, now pressed down, hard. The Jeep's engine roared in response, and the speedometer needle climbed past 80. I wasn't just continuing my mission. I was accelerating into the storm. That warning wasn't a stop sign. It was a confirmation. Cascade Echo was real. And whatever it was worth killing for. Good. Now they knew I was coming. The warning on the highway wasn't a deterrent, it was a roadmap. It told me exactly where not to look, which meant I knew precisely where the truth was hidden. The official channels, JIGWICs, the service records, anything on the military's digital grid, were compromised. They were watched. I was being herded away from the pasture, and my only option was to jump the fence. I needed something analog, something physical, something that couldn't be deleted with a keystroke. I needed to go to the source. That evening, I booked a one-way flight to St. Louis, Missouri. Destination, the National Personnel Records Center. The massive, bureaucratic heart of the nation's military history. Going in through the front door as Captain Fox was a non-starter. My name was likely already flagged. I had to go in through a side entrance, and for that I had to call in a marker. The debt belonged to a colonel whose career I'd saved 2 years ago with a timely intelligence brief that stopped him from walking his unit into a disaster. He owed me. He knew it, and I knew it. When he answered the phone, his voice was wary. "I need 15 minutes in the deep freeze," I said, no preamble, no small talk. The silence on his end was long and heavy. The deep freeze wasn't an official designation you'd find on a map. It was an insider's term for the high-density, climate-controlled subterranean levels, where the most sensitive and often darkest records were kept under lock and key. It was the nation's memory hole. "Julia, whatever you're into, you need to walk away," he finally said, his voice a low warning. "I can't," I replied. "Sir?" Another long pause. I heard him sigh, the sound of a man weighing his pension against a debt of honor. "You have 10 minutes, he said, his voice grim. "I'll have someone meet you at the West Loading Dock at 2200. Don't be late. And Julia? Don't let anyone see you. I was never part of this." The call ended. This was it, the final gamble. If I was caught, it wouldn't be a reprimand. It would be a court-martial, the end of my career, the loss of everything I had ever worked for. I accepted the terms. The deep freeze lived up to its name. The air was frigid and dry, smelling of old paper and preservation chemicals. My contact was a nervous, older archivist who didn't look at me. He simply pointed toward a single, antiquated computer terminal glowing green in the oppressive dark and then melted back into the shadows. The room was a cavern of metal shelving, stretching up into darkness and disappearing into infinity in every direction. The silence was absolute. My 10 minutes were ticking. I sat down, my fingers cold on the keyboard. I typed in the only access code I had, the 2 words from the lid of the footlocker. Cascade Echo. The screen flickered. A new prompt appeared. Secondary authentication required. My mind raced back to the tactical map of Grenada I'd found in the chest. It was covered in grid lines, coordinates, operational markings. But one set of numbers had been circled, faintly, in pencil. A coordinate that corresponded to nothing on the map. It wasn't a location. It was a password. I typed in the 8 digits, 45AT1984. My breath hitched. The screen blinked once, then twice. And then, a single file materialized from the digital ether. A file designation that made no official sense. File 12 Alpha CE. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I opened it. The file was a dense mosaic of redacted reports, encoded communiques, and cold, clinical military jargon. It was an operational history, but one with huge, blacked-out holes. I scrolled faster, my eyes scanning for keywords. Fallow, Whitmore, Grenada. My time was running out. Then I saw a subsection heading. It was a standard intelligence assessment category, but seeing it here in this context felt profane. Section 4. Collateral Risks, Exploitable Weaknesses. I clicked on it, and the world fell out from under me. There was only one entry, a single, typewritten line, as cold and impersonal as a coroner's report. Asset E, daughter of TFW, age 3, Savannah, GA, birth name, Theophania F. Whitmore. I read the line again, and again. The words swam before my eyes, refusing to make sense. Theophania. The name was a ghost on my tongue. My mother's choice, a beautiful, old-world name from a saint she admired. A name my father had dismissed as too soft, too weak, changing it to Julia before I was old enough to know the difference. It was me. I was Asset E. A wave of nausea churned in my stomach, hot and acidic. In this file, this dark history of a mission gone wrong, I wasn't a person. I wasn't a daughter or a granddaughter. I was a risk, a vulnerability, a potential target. The carefully constructed identity of Captain Julia Fox shattered into a million pieces, leaving behind a terrified 3-year-old girl who had a name she didn't even recognize. My hand was shaking as I scrolled down. Below the entry was a scanned document, a handwritten letter, the script a furious, desperate scrawl. It was from Marcus Fallow. a final frantic message to an unknown contact. "If Whitmore and his hounds don't get me out, I talk," it read. "I tell the world about Cascade Echo, and I'll start by letting them know he has a granddaughter in Savannah. She's my ace in the hole. One phone call is all it would take to make her disappear." I had to grab the edge of the cold metal desk to keep from falling. The room was spinning. Marcus Fallow, the man I thought was a missing soldier, a victim, had been planning to use me. To have me kidnapped or killed to save his own skin. I was his leverage. And my grandfather, Lieutenant Colonel Everett Whitmore. He hadn't been on a sanctioned mission. There was no official order. When he went to Grenada 2 years after his retirement, he wasn't a soldier. He was a hunter. He had disobeyed direct orders, gone completely off the books, and undertaken a rogue, one-man operation. He hadn't gone to rescue Marcus Fallow. He had gone to silence him. Permanently. To protect me. Every memory of my life reconfigured itself in that sickening, heart-stopping instant. His distance, his coldness. The way he never looked at me with affection. It wasn't disdain. It wasn't disappointment. It was a shield. He had pushed me away, kept me at arm's length to protect me from the world he inhabited. The world that saw a 3-year-old girl as Asset E. A quote from a writer, Brené Brown, flashed in my mind. Something I'd read once and dismissed as civilian psychology. Vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up when you can't control the outcome. I wasn't in control. My whole life, I'd been a pawn in a game I never knew was being played. But I was here. I had shown up. And now, I had to face the devastating truth of what my grandfather had done for me. He hadn't just sacrificed his career, he had sacrificed his soul. The flight back to Savannah was a blur. I moved through the airport like a sleepwalker, the world muted and distant, as if I were watching it through thick glass. The truth I discovered in that cold, dark archive wasn't a piece of intelligence I could process and file away. It was too large, too heavy. It was a living thing, a parasite that had attached itself to my soul. And its weight was crushing me. That night, sleep was an impossibility. My apartment, usually a haven of order and quiet, felt like a tomb. The silence was suffocating, filled with the ghosts of questions I'd never known to ask. The line from the file replayed in my mind on an endless loop. Birth name? Theophania F. Whitmore. A name that belonged to a stranger, a little girl who was a target. I had to get out. I drove aimlessly through the Savannah streets, the familiar Spanish moss hanging from the oak trees looking like funeral shrouds in the yellow glow of the streetlights. I needed noise. I needed light. I needed the mundane reality of other people living their lives to anchor me to the present. I ended up where many Southerners do when they're lost in the middle of the night. The bright, welcoming beacon of a Waffle House. The moment I stepped inside, the sensory overload was a relief. The smell of sizzling bacon and brewing coffee, the clatter of plates, the low murmur of conversations. It was a symphony of normalcy. I slid into a booth, ordered a black coffee I didn't want, and just sat there, letting the ordinary world wash over me, trying to push back the extraordinary darkness that had consumed my own. I don't know how long I stayed, staring into my cup as if the answers were floating in the black liquid. An hour. Maybe 2. Finally, the suffocating feeling in my chest eased just enough for me to breathe. I paid my bill and walked back out into the cool, humid air of the parking lot, and that's when my training screamed at me. He was leaning against the driver's side door of my Jeep, one foot crossed over the other, perfectly at ease. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a simple nylon bomber jacket despite the Georgia warmth. In the dim light, I could just make out the symbol on his dark blue ball cap, the iconic trident of a Navy SEAL. My blood ran cold, but I didn't hesitate. I didn't slow my pace. Fear was a luxury I couldn't afford. I stopped 5 feet in front of him, squared my shoulders, and did the only thing I knew how to do. I reported for duty. "I am Captain Julia Fox," I said, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the night air. The man, who had been watching me with a completely neutral expression, straightened up. It was a subtle shift, but I recognized it instantly. He wasn't seeing a frightened woman in a parking lot anymore. He was seeing an officer. His posture changed from casual repose to something akin to parade rest. He gave me a single, sharp nod, a gesture of respect from one professional to another, then pushed himself off my car, turned, and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as silently as he had appeared. And I understood. He wasn't a threat. He was a sentry. A guardian angel in a bomber jacket, dispatched to ensure I was safe after I'd kicked the hornet's nest. The community, as the voice on the phone had called it, wasn't hunting me. They were protecting me. Protecting the granddaughter of one of their own. As if on cue, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. Blocked number. I answered without a word. It was the same flat, emotionless voice. The operator. But the tone wasn't a warning this time. It was a debriefing. "You know," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. Everett Whitmore acted against protocol. The voice stated, a simple reporting of facts. He went to Grenada on his own authority. His mission was not to rescue Marcus Fallow, it was to neutralize a direct threat to his bloodline. There was a brief pause, just a beat of silence. We could have had him court-martialed. His actions were unsanctioned. But some missions fall outside the manuals, Captain. Your grandfather. He was the sword to destroy the enemy and the shield to protect what was most precious. The words hung in the air, a painful, beautiful epitaph. The sword and the shield. It was the most honorable description of a soldier I'd ever heard, and it broke something deep inside me. Why? The question tore from my throat, raw and ragged, the carefully constructed walls of my military discipline crumbling into dust. My voice cracked for the first time. Why was he so cold to me? My whole life. He looked at me like I was a stranger. For the first time, a trace of something other than cold professionalism entered the operator's voice. It was almost empathy. Because that was the only way to protect you, Captain, he said, his tone softening just a fraction. In our world, love is a security breach. It's a vulnerability that can be exploited. After Grenada, he knew that. He had to erase you from his life, push you away, to make sure no one could ever use you to get to him again. His distance, that was his battlefield. He fought on it every single day of his life so that you could be safe. The line went dead. I stood alone in the empty Waffle House parking lot, the phone still pressed to my ear, and the tears, the ones I had held back for my entire life, finally came. They weren't tears for the little girl who felt unloved. They were for the old soldier who had been forced to treat his greatest love like a classified secret. The man who had shouldered a burden of silent, lonely sacrifice every single day, just for me. All those years of seeking his approval, of feeling like a disappointment, I had misunderstood everything. His coldness wasn't rejection, it was his ultimate act of protection. If you've ever had a parent, a grandparent, or someone you loved who showed their love in a complicated, difficult, or silent way, please support this story with a like, and if you feel comfortable, just comment with the words, "I understand." Because sometimes the greatest battles are the ones we never get to see. I hadn't been abandoned. I had been protected. All along, I was his most important mission. The revelation in the Waffle House parking lot didn't bring peace. It brought a profound, aching clarity. My grandfather wasn't a cold, distant figure. He was a shield. A silent guardian who had sacrificed his own peace of mind for my safety. The weight of that knowledge settled upon me, not as a burden, but as a sacred duty. His story couldn't remain buried in a forgotten footlocker and a black site file. His honor had to be restored. Back in my small Savannah apartment, I sat at my laptop. The pre-dawn light began to filter through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. On the table beside me, I had arranged the evidence like a soldier laying out a field kit. The faded tactical map of Grenada, the cold steel of Marcus Fallow's dog tag, and a printed copy of the file designated 12 Alpha CE. They were the components of a story that had been kept in darkness for too long. I opened a new email. My fingers flew across the keyboard with a purpose I hadn't felt in my entire life. 2. Army Decorations Board. The Pentagon. Subject: Posthumous Medal of Honor Recommendation, Lieutenant Colonel Everett Whitmore. I wrote with the clinical precision of an intelligence officer. I detailed the unsanctioned operation in Grenada. I described how Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore, a civilian at the time, had single-handedly neutralized a credible threat to national security, a rogue operative threatening to expose a deep-cover operation. I attached the scanned letter from Fallow as proof of the threat. I was careful, precise. I never mentioned that the threat, the leverage Fallow intended to use, was a 3-year-old girl. I never mentioned my name. I framed it as an act of selfless patriotism, a soldier stepping out of retirement one last time to protect his country, no matter the personal cost. With a click of a button, I could rewrite history. I could transform my grandfather from a quiet retiree into the national hero he deserved to be. And, a small vindictive part of me admitted, I could throw that victory in my father's face. I could prove that the legacy he so coveted was built on a foundation he never even understood. My finger hovered over the mouse, poised above the send button. But I hesitated. A cold wave of doubt washed over me. Was this what he would have wanted? I was honoring his actions, yes. But was I betraying his intent? His final mission hadn't been to become a hero. His final mission was to protect me. And the core of that protection was silence, invisibility. He had erased himself from my life to keep me safe. By dragging his story into the light, was I honoring him, or was I undoing the very sacrifice he had made? I was caught between two impossible choices: justice for the soldier or fealty to the grandfather. I needed one last piece of information. I needed to know. I picked up my phone and dialed my father's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice as cold and clipped as ever. "Father," I said, dispensing with any pleasantries. "Cascade Echo, Marcus Fallow, I know everything." The silence that followed was different from any I'd ever shared with him. It wasn't the silence of disapproval or dismissal. It was the heavy, knowing silence of a soldier who had been waiting for this exact transmission for decades. "Yes," General Fox finally said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "I figured you would. Your grandfather made me swear an oath." The words hit me like a physical blow, a second betrayal that cut even deeper than the first. "You knew?" I whispered, my voice trembling with a fresh wave of agony. "You knew what he did for me, and you still treated me like that? At the VFW? My entire life?" My father's voice hardened, the familiar steel returning to it. "That was not your concern. His legacy is not some heartwarming story to be told at dinner parties. It is a burden. I had to see if you were strong enough to carry it, or if you would shatter and use it as an excuse to seek pity." I felt the air leave my lungs, my throat constricted. It wasn't hate, it wasn't even indifference. It was a test, a cruel, inhuman, lifelong test designed by the one man who should have protected me from such things. "So what are you going to do now?" General Fox asked, his voice laced with a cold challenge. "You're going to make it public, aren't you? To prove me wrong?" I was silent, unable to speak past the lump of grief and rage in my throat. "Before you do," he continued, and for the first time, I heard a crack in his iron facade, a hint of profound weariness. "Ask yourself this. Your grandfather sacrificed his reputation, his public honor, to keep you safe and invisible. If you drag this into the light, are you honoring him, or are you destroying his final mission? True honor isn't on a medal, Julia. It's in the burdens you choose to carry in silence." He hung up. I stared at the send button on the screen, my world reduced to that single, clickable word. My father's words echoed in my head, a cruel and logical trap. But something was missing. His philosophy was one of cold, hard duty. My grandfather's sacrifice felt like something more. My eyes fell on the old footlocker. I remembered something I'd overlooked in my haste, a small, dusty microcassette recorder. I found the tape inside and pressed play. A low hiss filled the room, and then I heard his voice, my grandfather's, younger, stronger than I remembered, but with the same quiet authority. He was talking to someone, Another man, his voice low and confessional. The mission was a failure, he was saying. We lost good men. There's no report you can write that changes that. You don't bury your mistakes. You carry them. It's the price of this uniform. The tape clicked off. I looked back at the screen. I finally understood. My father saw the legacy as a burden of silence, a secret to be kept. But my grandfather, he saw it as a burden of responsibility. You don't bury it, you carry it. I knew what I had to do. My father saw honor as a burden of silence, but my grandfather's voice on that old tape taught me something different. You don't bury your mistakes, you carry them. It was the price of the uniform. He wasn't hiding his story, he was carrying it, and now, so would I. My eyes moved from the laptop screen back to the send button. I didn't delete the email. Deleting it would have been an act of fear, of erasure. That wasn't what this was about. Instead, with a quiet, deliberate click, I dragged the draft into my archive folder. It would not be sent, but it would not be destroyed. It would be carried. My decision was made. Now, I had to see it through. With the same precision I used to plan a mission, I began a new kind of ceremony. I turned on my printer and one by one printed out the sacred texts of my family's secret history. The crisp, clean copy of the file designated 12 Alpha CE. Its clinical typewritten words a stark contrast to the horror they described. The grainy scan of Marcus Fallow's desperate, threatening letter. And finally, the official copy of my grandfather's service record, the document that contained the lie that had protected the truth for so long. I stacked the papers, their edges perfectly aligned. The stack felt impossibly heavy in my hands, far heavier than its physical weight. I slid the entire dossier into a thick, brown security envelope, the kind used for classified documents. I sealed the flap, the adhesive making a soft, final sound in the quiet of my apartment. The next morning, I put in for a few days of personal leave and packed a small bag. I didn't need much. This wasn't a vacation, it was a pilgrimage. I got into my Jeep and pointed it north, merging onto the endless river of asphalt that was Interstate 95. My destination, College Park, Maryland. The National Archives. The 10-hour drive was a long, hypnotic meditation. The miles dissolved behind me as the landscape shifted from the low country of Georgia to the rolling hills of the Carolinas and Virginia. I didn't listen to music or podcasts. I just listened to the hum of the tires on the road and the echo of my grandfather's voice in my memory. I remembered him quoting scripture once, on a rare, quiet afternoon when I was a teenager. He was cleaning his old service pistol, a ritual he performed with reverent focus. I had asked him why he did what he did, why he had chosen a soldier's life. He didn't look up from his work. He just quoted, his voice a low rumble. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. At the time, I thought he meant dying in battle. Now, driving through the heart of the country he'd served, I finally understood. He hadn't laid down his life in a blaze of glory. He had laid down his life, his career, his reputation, his relationship with me, piece by piece, every single day, in silence. It was a quieter, lonelier, and perhaps greater sacrifice. Each mile I drove felt like a step away from the selfish girl who had craved recognition, and a step closer to the soldier who understood the weight of that sacrifice. When I arrived at the National Archives, it felt less like a government building and more like a temple dedicated to memory. I didn't go through the main entrance or try to use my military credentials. This wasn't official business. This was personal. I found my way to a quiet, less trafficked section and approached an older archivist working behind a large wooden desk. He had the kind of calm, knowing eyes that had seen 1,000 stories come and go. "Excuse me," I said, my voice even. "I have a collection of sensitive family documents. I'd like to place them in long-term, sealed storage." He looked up at me, his gaze lingering for a moment. He didn't just see a young woman in civilian clothes. I could tell he saw the invisible uniform I was wearing, the one defined by duty and purpose. He saw a soldier. He gave a slow, understanding nod and slid a form across the desk without a word. The form was simple: name, date, contents. But then there was a line that asked, "Reason for sealing." My father would have left it blank. For him, the reason was self-evident: secrecy. But for my grandfather, and now for me, the reason was everything. I picked up the pen and wrote a single, clear line: to protect a soldier's honor. Before I handed him the envelope, I took out a small blank card from my wallet. On it, I wrote a short note, a message in a bottle for the future. I didn't sign it. The message wasn't from me, it was from the legacy itself. Some secrets are created to protect, I wrote. But the ones worth keeping always find the right soldier to listen. I placed the card on top of the documents inside the envelope and sealed it one last time. On the outside label, I wrote the instructions: to be sealed for a period of 50 years, not to be opened except by direct request from a descendant of Whitmore. I handed the package to the archivist. He took it with a quiet reverence, as if accepting a sacred artifact. He stamped it with a heavy, official-looking seal, the date clanking with finality. Then, he placed the envelope into a gray, metal archival box. He closed the lid and turned the key in the lock. Click. The sound was small, but it echoed in the vast, silent room. It wasn't the sound of a door closing. It was the sound of a mission completed. A profound sense of peace washed over me, a tranquility I had never known. The weight I had carried since opening that footlocker, the weight of anger and confusion and betrayal, was suddenly lifted. It hadn't vanished. It had simply been put in its proper place, stored, honored, carried. The long drive back to Georgia from Maryland was an exercise in silence. Not the heavy, oppressive silence of my childhood, but a new kind. A comfortable, contemplative quiet that filled the cab of my Jeep. I didn't turn on the radio or listen to a podcast. For the first time, the stillness wasn't something to be endured, it was something to be inhabited. It felt like a part of me now, a familiar companion on the road home. My first stop wasn't my apartment. The piece I'd found in that archive in Maryland wasn't meant for those four walls. It belonged somewhere else. I drove to the outskirts of Savannah, to the forgotten industrial park, and pulled up to storage unit number 11. The place that had once been a source of mystery and dread now felt like a sacred space, a personal chapel built of corrugated metal and concrete. I slid the heavy metal door upward, and the late afternoon Georgia sun spilled inside, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like golden pollen. It cast a warm, reverent light on the old wooden footlocker, which sat waiting patiently in the center of the room. I hadn't come empty-handed. From a small bag, I took out a soft, clean cloth and a small bottle of wood polish. It was the same kind my grandfather used to use on the antique furniture in his study. The scent of lemon oil and old memories filled the small space. With the slow, deliberate motions of a soldier tending to their weapon, I began the ceremony. I carefully wiped away the layers of dust from the lid of the footlocker, the grain of the dark wood emerging like a forgotten map. Each stroke was a meditation, a silent thank you. I wasn't just cleaning a piece of furniture, I was tending to a monument. Once the surface was clean and gleaming with a soft sheen, I began to build my small memorial. I took out the old military watch with its cracked crystal face. I placed it gently in the exact center of the lid. It was no longer just evidence of a forgotten conflict. It was now a symbol of a single moment in time that had stopped, a sacrifice made to allow another life to continue. Next to it, I placed the dog tag of Marcus Fallow. I laid it flat, the stamped letters facing up. It wasn't an accusation anymore, or the clue to a mystery. It was a somber reminder of the cost, the price that had been paid on all sides. These two objects, the broken watch and the metal tag, sat side by side, representing the beginning and the end of my grandfather's final, silent mission. Then, I reached into my bag for the last piece of my ritual. It was a small tin box, the kind soldiers often use to keep personal effects safe. Letters, photos, small keepsakes. A time capsule. Inside, I had placed a carefully folded copy of the letter my grandfather had left for me with Mr. Caldwell. His strong, disciplined handwriting filled the page, a final set of orders from a beloved commander. But I had made an addition. With a fountain pen, the same kind my grandfather had used, I had written my own words at the bottom of the page. It was my final report, my after-action review, submitted across the veil of time and memory. Mission complete. You were not the shadow. You were the shield. Rest easy, Lieutenant Colonel. I closed the tin box, the small click echoing in the quiet. I placed it inside the now empty footlocker. It was a message for the future, a time capsule containing a truth that had been carried, understood, and finally put to rest. I stood up and took a step back, looking at my work for the last time. The polished footlocker, the watch, the dog tag. Everything was in its proper place. Order had been restored. I didn't lock the footlocker. I left the lid slightly ajar, an invitation to any curious historian or future descendant who might one day stumble upon this place. The story wasn't mine to own forever. I was just its keeper for now. I turned and walked to the entrance. Taking a firm grip on the handle, I pulled the heavy, corrugated metal door down. Clang! The sound of metal hitting concrete was loud and final, echoing in the stillness of the evening. But to me, it wasn't the sound of a closing door. It wasn't the end of an old chapter. It was a final, solitary rifle salute, fired not in mourning for a man who had died, but in honor of a legacy that would now live forever. The clang of the storage unit door didn't haunt me. It had been a final, definitive sound, and in its wake, it left a profound silence. A few months later, on a warm Sunday morning in Savannah, that silence felt like peace. I wasn't in uniform. I was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, sitting on the porch of my small apartment with a steaming mug of coffee. My view looked out over the green expanse of Forsyth Park, where the famous fountain shimmered in the morning light and Spanish moss dripped from the ancient live oaks like tangled gray lace. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt full. The burden of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer weighed me down. It had settled into me, reformed itself. It had become my spine, the very thing that gave me strength and kept me standing tall. I was watching a young couple push their child on a swing when a figure appeared at the edge of my walkway. It was my father. He wasn't wearing his uniform either. In a simple polo shirt and khaki pants, he looked smaller, older. The larger-than-life aura of the general was gone, replaced by the quiet fragility of a man approaching old age. He hadn't called ahead. "I was passing through," he said, his voice softer than I was used to. It was the standard excuse for a man who didn't know how to say what he really meant. I didn't say anything. I just gestured to the empty chair beside me. He sat, and for a long time, we just watched the park together. We were two soldiers, fluent in the language of silence. There were no apologies to be made, no explanations to be given. We both understood the landscape of duty, the geography of hard choices. Finally, he spoke, his eyes fixed on the fountain in the distance. "Your grandfather," he said, his voice thick with a lifetime of unspoken emotion. "He would have been proud of you." I took a slow sip of my coffee. A year ago, those words would have been everything. They would have been the validation I'd spent my entire life fighting for. Now, they were just words. I didn't need them anymore, but I accepted them. Not as an apology, but as a truce. A quiet acknowledgement that we were both soldiers, carrying our own burdens, fighting our own silent wars. I simply nodded. And in that moment, the long battle between us was finally over. My life found a new rhythm after that. At Fort Stewart, I threw myself into my work with a renewed sense of purpose. One afternoon, I was assigned to mentor a newly commissioned second lieutenant, fresh out of West Point. Her name was Eva. She was brilliant, driven, and full of the same fierce, simmering doubt that had once consumed me. I saw myself in the way she always felt the need to prove herself twice as hard as her male counterparts. After a particularly grueling field training exercise, we were cleaning our rifles in the humid Georgia air. She was quiet for a long time before she finally looked at me, her young face etched with fatigue and uncertainty. "Ma'am," she began, her voice low, "how do you do it? All of it. The pressure, the judgment. How do you carry it all?" I looked at her, and in her tired, questioning eyes, I saw the ghost of the young cadet I used to be. The girl who was desperate for a map, for a sign that she was on the right path. She hesitated, then added, I mean, everyone knows about your father. Your family legacy must be heavy. I stopped polishing the bolt of my rifle and looked at her. A genuine smile, warm and unforced, spread across my face. The bitterness that had defined me for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet, settled wisdom. I shook my head gently. Legacy isn't a name on a building or the medals left to you, I said, my voice calm and clear. My grandfather taught me that. The real legacy. It's the strength, the integrity, and the kindness you leave in other people. I reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. Her tired posture straightened just a little. And that, I continued, looking her straight in the eye, is the legacy you get to build for yourself. Starting right now. I turned my gaze toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I couldn't rewrite my grandfather's file. I couldn't give him the public honor he deserved. But I finally understood his mission, and now I had my own. To be the shield for the next generation. To be the person for Lieutenant Eva that I had so desperately needed when I was her age. Captain Julia Fox. Soldier. Granddaughter. I had finally found my place. I was the keeper of the silent legacy, and that was the greatest honor of all. And so, my war ended. Not with a bang, but with a quiet understanding. My grandfather taught me that legacy isn't what's left for you, but what's left inside of you, and the strength you leave inside of others. That's the mission I carry now. If this journey has meant something to you, your support means the world to our community. Please consider liking this story and subscribing for more journeys of strength and resilience. And in the comments, I would be honored if you shared just one thing. Who was the shield that protected you? Thank you for listening.